Hi, in this video I want to talk a little bit about the differences between Eastern swords and Western swords. Now this, as I'm sure you're aware, is a katana. This is a fairly standard Japanese sword. It comes as part of a pair. The katana is the longer of the two. It tends to be paired with a wakizashi, and it's very much a badge of rank. It's a status symbol, if you like. Now these have got a lot of myths pertaining to them, and let's face it, they're fantastic swords, but they're not the be-all and end-all when it comes to swords. The first thing is, they're really quite heavy. They tend to be heavier than their counterparts in the Western world. Now this obviously is a single-handed sword as opposed to a double-handed sword, but as you can see, the blade length is actually longer in the backsword than it is in the katana. Also, what you tend to find is that the thickness of the metal is more in the katana than in the backsword, and there's a fairly insignificant amount of distal taper where there's a fairly significant amount of distal taper, which effectively means the sword in the Western sword is thicker at the ricasso and thinner at the tip, whereas in the Japanese sword there's very little difference. Now, these are great for cutting because they have this beautiful slight curve to them, in much the same way that a guillotine cuts by having an angled blade. It cuts more effectively. The fact that this is a curved sword allows it to cut in a more effective manner. However, that's not why it's curved. And it's a very interesting process. What happens is that the steel is hardened in such a way that only the edge becomes hard and the back remains soft. And that produces a different crystalline structure within the steel. So the blade, the cutting edge, tends to be a form of steel called martensite, which is very hard and quite brittle. If you make the whole sword out of that, then it'll just smash when you hit it against something. So the back is a mixture of ferrite and pearlite. Now it's exactly the same material, it's the same steel, but it's been treated in a different way so that it has different properties, and that's much softer, and that allows the blade to be a little bit sprungy. But in doing that, it gives the sword a curve, and that's just a byproduct of the different crystalline structures. What tends to happen is the blade is formed almost straight, and then when it's quenched in water, the curve appears by itself. Now, skilled swords makers can control that so they get the curve they want, but the fact is the curve is a byproduct of the forging process. In the same way that the hamon, this temper line that you see on Japanese swords, is also a byproduct of that quenching process. The grain in the steel is a byproduct of the folding of the steel that's done. And let's be honest, that's only done because their steel was incredibly poor quality and it had to be folded repeatedly in order to get the impurities out. If you're interested, that very same process is used in wrought iron. So any old ironwork, any railings or gates or anything like that you see in country houses or stately homes, that's been folded too, in just the same way that Japanese swords have. So this is a great sword, but please don't be confused as to why it is the way it is. It's not made that way to make it special, it's made that way to make it into a functional sword. Now, let's move on. Now the backsword, the steel for this isn't folded. It doesn't have to be because the steel is good quality. It isn't differentially hardened, so the blade isn't harder than the back because it doesn't have to be. Because swordsmiths in Europe were making swords, they were hardening the blades, and then they were tempering them off so that the blade becomes springier, so it has a resilience all through it. So the whole blade is more resilient. Now with the katana, the back of the steel is quite soft, so that allows it to bend, and to a degree the sword will bend Now it can be straightened and it can be reheat treated, and that was relatively common. But this gives you a more resilient sword. But don't be fooled into thinking that swords were made to last. They weren't. They were made to fight with, to keep you alive, and if you got to the end of your duel, your fight or your battle, and the sword was broken or bent, brilliant. But you were still alive. You'd throw it away and you'd get another one made. Or at least you would in Europe, because we had plenty of steel. We had plenty of resources available, and that's why the Japanese focused so much on their swords and developed the processes they had. It's because they had to, because of the lack of high quality metal that they had to make the swords. Anyway, rant over. I hope some of this has been some use to you, and thanks for listening.